The sound of shattering glass jolted Margaret Wilson from her sleep. Her eyes snapped open in the darkness, but her body remained perfectly still, an old habit from another life. She listened, filtering the normal sounds of her farmhouse from the abnormal. The tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway, the gentle hum of the refrigerator, and there a soft creak from the porch steps that shouldn't be there. In one fluid motion, Margaret slid open the nightstand drawer and retrieved her Beretta M9, the weight familiar in her hand. She moved through the darkness with the practiced silence of someone who had done this many times before in places far more dangerous than a Nevada farmhouse. Margaret paused at the top of the stairs, listening again. The sound didn't repeat. False alarm, perhaps, or an animal. But she wouldn't take chances. Not anymore. Not with what had been happening at the clinic. She completed her sweep of the house, finding nothing out of place. Returning to her bedroom, Margaret secured the Beretta in its place, but didn't immediately return to bed. Instead, she stood before the photograph on her dresser. Robert, in his deputy sheriff's uniform, his smile genuine beneath the brim of his tan Stetson. 7 years gone, but the ache remained. "Just being cautious, Bobby," she whispered to the empty room. "Nothing to worry about." But that wasn't entirely true, and Margaret Wilson had never been one for self-deception. Morning arrived in Ridgewood the way it always did, with little ceremony and less fanfare. First light brushed the eastern slopes of the distant Nevada mountains, painting them copper and gold. Margaret stood on her front porch, coffee mug, warming her palms, watching as dawn crawled across her property. At 43, Margaret still turned heads in Ridgewood. Her dark hair, now threaded with strands of silver at the temples, was pulled back in a practical ponytail. Time had etched fine lines around her green eyes, but they remained sharp, missing nothing. The locals said those eyes had seen more than most. They weren't wrong. The farmhouse behind her had weathered 60 Nevada winters. Its white paint had surrendered in patches to the relentless sun, but the structure remained solid, like Margaret herself. 7 years a widow, she had learned that some things break while others merely weather. Robert had been everything the small town of Ridgewood respected: dedicated deputy sheriff, volunteer firefighter, little league coach. A cruiser had delivered the news on a Tuesday evening. Routine traffic stop turned deadly. Shot twice at point-blank range, didn't suffer. The platitudes offered by the department chaplain had washed over Margaret like rain on parched earth, quickly absorbed, leaving no trace. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 6, time to leave for the clinic. Margaret's 1992 Ford F-150 kicked up dust as she navigated the unpaved road from her property to the county highway. The truck had been Robert's, another memory she couldn't bring herself to relinquish. The radio played Merle Haggard's "The Way I Am," taking Margaret back to slow dances with Robert at the VFW hall, his hand warm against the small of her back. Ridgewood emerged from the morning haze, a collection of weathered buildings clustered around Main Street. Jensen's Hardware stood on the corner, its faded sign declaring, "Serving Ridgewood since 1943. Next door, the Bluebird Diner's neon sign glowed blue against the morning sky, while across the street, Western Drug's vintage Coca-Cola thermometer already registered 80 degrees. Margaret parked behind the Ridgewood Community Medical Center, a brick building that had once housed the town's bank. The original vault now stored medical supplies, a fact Margaret had always appreciated for its symbolism. "Morning, Ellen," Margaret called as she entered through the back door. Ellen Matthews looked up from the scheduling book at the nurse's station, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. At 65, Ellen had been serving Ridgewood's medical needs since before Margaret was born. "You're early, dear," Ellen observed. "Couldn't sleep again." Margaret shrugged off her light jacket. "Just wanted to get ahead of the paperwork. Dr. Preston coming in today. 9 o'clock. His wife's got that arthritis flare-up again." Ellen pushed a stack of patient files across the counter. "Mrs. Henderson at 8 for her blood pressure. The Peterson boy at 8:30, another ear infection. I'd bet my pension on it." But lately something had been changing in the rhythm of the clinic. Margaret had sensed it first about 3 months ago, an uptick in unfamiliar faces, men mostly with vague complaints. Back pain, migraines, insomnia, all requesting specific medications by name. James Preston had become increasingly uncomfortable with the pattern. 2 weeks ago, he'd called a meeting with the staff, his normally genial face grave beneath his salt and pepper beard. "We're seeing too many out-of-town patients requesting opioids," he'd said. "I've spoken with Sheriff Miller. He says there's been similar reports from clinics in Millwood and Pineview, some kind of prescription network forming. Margaret's thoughts were interrupted by a knock on her doorframe. Frank Miller stood there looking every bit the aging lawman in his tan uniform and white Stetson. Deep lines were carved into his weathered face, his blue eyes clear despite the 60-plus years behind them. "Got a minute?" he asked, voice gravelly, from decades of unfiltered Marlboros. Margaret gestured to the chair across from her desk. "For the sheriff, always." Frank settled his lanky frame into the seat, removing his hat and placing it on his knee. He and Robert had come up through the academy together, remained friends for 20 years. After Robert died, Frank had become something between a protective older brother and a surrogate father to Margaret. "Stop by to give you a heads up," he said, keeping his voice low. "Got word from Carson City about that group we discussed. They're expanding operations." Margaret felt a familiar tightness in her chest. "Here. Can't say for certain, but there have been sightings. 3 men in a black Suburban with California plates at the Ridgewood Inn last night." Frank leaned forward, his voice dropping even lower. "There's something else you should know. The clinic in Millwood, Dr. Chambers, closed up shop last week. Just disappeared overnight." "What? Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "Didn't want to worry you without cause, but I got a call from Jack Prescott over in Millwood yesterday." Chambers' nurse finally talked. "Said they'd been receiving threats for weeks after refusing to play ball with some medical supply company. The night before they cleared out, someone broke into the doctor's house, left pictures of his kids at school on the kitchen table." Margaret felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. This wasn't just about illegal prescriptions anymore. These people were organized, methodical, dangerous. After Frank left, Margaret sat quietly at her desk. That part of her life, 4 tours overseas, not as a combat soldier. Women weren't officially allowed in those roles then, but as a combat medic attached to an all-female special operations unit, was buried along with her military records and classified archives. The Sentinels, they'd called themselves unofficially. 8 women with specialized training deployed for missions that required female operators. That life had ended 15 years ago before meeting Robert before nursing school. Margaret Wilson, the quiet, competent nurse of Ridgewood, Nevada, had once been Staff Sergeant Margaret Reynolds' decorated combat medic with more confirmed kills than most infantry soldiers. At 10:30, with no patients waiting, Margaret stepped into the small break room for a moment of quiet. Through the window, she could see Main Street quiet as usual. Margaret had chosen Ridgewood precisely because nothing ever happened here. That sense of security shattered at precisely 11:17 a.m., when a black Suburban with California plates pulled into the clinic's small parking lot. Margaret watched from the break room window as 3 men emerged from the vehicle. The leader, immediately identified as such from his body language and the deference shown by the others, was tall and lean, perhaps 50, with close-cropped silver hair and the hard physique of someone who maintained military discipline long after leaving service. The second man was younger, bulkier, with a neck too thick for his collar and hands that hung at his sides like weapons waiting to be deployed. The third was wiry, nervous, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. "Ellen," Margaret said quietly, "call Sheriff Miller. Tell him our California visitors are here." Ellen's eyes widened slightly, but she reached for the phone without question. Margaret moved to the center of the waiting room as the door opened and the 3 men entered. "Good morning," she said, professional smile in place. "Welcome to Ridgewood Medical Center. How can I help you today?" The leader returned her smile, a practiced expression that never reached his eyes. "Good morning, I hope you can help us. My associate here," he gestured to the bulky man beside him, "has been experiencing some severe back pain. We were told Dr. Preston might be able to help." "Dr. Preston is with a patient at the moment. I'm Margaret Wilson, head nurse. If your friend would like to fill out some paperwork, I can see if we can fit him in with the doctor later today." "That's very kind," the leader said smoothly, "but I understand there might be ways to expedite things. We're just passing through, you see. Perhaps some pain medication to tide him over." "I'm afraid I can't prescribe controlled substances," Margaret replied. "Only Dr. Preston can do that, and he'll need to examine the patient first." The leader's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course, we understand protocol. It's just that my friend is in considerable discomfort, and we were told this clinic might be more accommodating than some others in the area. Margaret felt a cold certainty settle in her stomach. I'm not sure who told you that, sir, but they were mistaken. We follow all state regulations regarding controlled substances. The three men turned and left. Ellen's hand trembled slightly as she hung up the phone. Sheriff's on his way, she whispered. The rest of the day passed without incident. At 6, Margaret locked up the clinic and walked to her truck. The slashed tires registered first, then the shattered driver's side window. Finally, the note tucked under the windshield wiper written on clinic stationery. The message was blunt: reconsider your position. We'll be back tomorrow for a more productive conversation. Ellen drove her home clucking with motherly concern about those awful men and insisting Margaret call if she needed anything. As soon as she was alone, Margaret moved with purpose. From the hall closet, she retrieved a small stepladder and positioned it beneath the attic access panel in the ceiling. The attic was clean and organized unlike most. Plastic bins labeled Christmas, winter clothes, and Robert's things were stacked neatly against the insulated walls. Margaret moved to the far corner, where an old steamer trunk sat beneath a dusty tarp. The trunk's brass lock opened with a key she kept on a chain around her neck. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was the evidence of a life Ridgewood had never seen. A Beretta M9 service pistol, a twin to the one in her nightstand, a K-bar combat knife, a tactical medical kit, a satellite phone with a single number programmed into it, and photographs 8 women in desert camouflage arms around each other's shoulders, standing before a Black Hawk helicopter. Margaret traced her finger over the faces. Rachel, Maria, Danielle, Elizabeth, Jasmine, Kate, Melissa, the Sentinels, her sisters in all but blood. Margaret had maintained contact with only one Rachel Torres, now living under her maiden name in Millwood, 30 miles east. After leaving the military, Rachel had joined the FBI's hostage rescue team before retiring due to a knee injury. If anyone would understand the situation Margaret now faced, it would be Rachel. She picked up the satellite phone and pressed the call button. Rachel answered on the second ring. Code in, came the familiar voice, still crisp, professional. Sierra Mike, July 2007. Margaret replied using her initials and the date of their last deployment together. Verified. Go ahead. Margaret outlined the situation succinctly, describing the men, the veiled threats, the vandalized truck. I know that group, Rachel said when Margaret finished. They've been on our radar. Started as prescription fraudsters in Southern California, escalated to pressuring and eventually taking over the small, rural clinics as distribution points. They're connected to a larger network moving product from Mexico, pills, heroin, meth. They use the legitimate prescriptions as cover and launder money through the clinic billing systems. It's sophisticated. I'm not going to let them establish here, Rachel. There was a pause on the line. I know that tone, Reynolds. What are you planning? Nothing yet, but I wanted you aware of the situation. I'll be there tomorrow. Don't engage until I arrive. The Bluebird Diner opened at 6 for the farmers and ranchers who started their days before dawn. Margaret arrived at 6:15 and took a booth in the back with a clearer view of the entrance and the parking lot beyond. At 6:22, a woman entered. She was Margaret's age, with auburn hair, cut in a practical bob, wearing jeans, hiking boots, and a flannel shirt beneath a leather jacket. To the casual observer, she looked like any other rural Nevada resident. Margaret knew better. Rachel Torres slid into the booth opposite Margaret with the fluid grace of someone who maintained peak physical condition despite a supposedly career-ending injury. You look like hell, Reynolds, she said by way of greeting, using Margaret's maiden name. Margaret smiled despite herself. Missed you too, Torres. Rachel leaned forward, sliding a small package across the table. Inside was an earpiece similar to a hearing aid, but far more sophisticated. Secure comms, Rachel explained. Military-grade encrypted range of about 2 miles in open terrain. Margaret pocketed the device. You expecting trouble? Rachel's smile was cold. I'm ensuring tactical advantage. Now tell me about these men. The leader described him again. Margaret did, noting the military bearing, the silver hair that contained menace. Rachel's expression darkened. Marcus Stone, former Force Recon Marine, dishonorably discharged in 2010 for excessive force against civilians in Afghanistan. Went private sector after that, mercenary work mainly. started showing up on law enforcement radar around 2015 in connection with various trafficking operations. Why would someone with his background be running prescription scams in rural Nevada seems beneath his skill set. Rachel nodded. That's what bothers me. There's something bigger happening. These small clinics, they're just nodes in a larger network. We're missing the bigger picture. The clinic's front door opened at 11:30, bell chiming pleasantly, as if this were any normal day. Margaret looked up from the computer, her professional smile firmly in place as Marcus Stone entered, flanked by the bulky man from the previous encounter. Stone was dressed more formally today, dark slacks, charcoal blazer over a black shirt. The impression was deliberate, a businessman here to conclude a transaction. "Good morning, Nurse Wilson," he said, voice pleasant. "I hope we're not too early for our appointment." Margaret maintained her composure. "I don't recall scheduling one Mr. Stone, Michael Stone." He glanced around the empty reception area. "I see you've prepared for our meeting. Privacy is appreciated." "The clinic is experiencing a slow morning," Margaret replied evenly. "How can I help you, Mr. Stone?" Stone moved further into the room, at his associate remaining near the door. "I represent Heartland Medical Supply, Nurse Wilson. We're expanding our services into this region, and we believe Ridgewood Clinic would be an ideal partner." "We already have suppliers, Mr. Stone." "I'm sure you do, but we offer a comprehensive package that goes beyond simple supply delivery. We help clinics like yours maximize their revenue potential." Margaret said nothing, waiting. In tactical situations, patience often revealed more than questioning. "You've presented me with a puzzle, Nurse Wilson. Most people in your position would have already capitulated or fled. You've done neither." "I'm not most people." "So you've said." Stone studied her with genuine curiosity. "What I can't determine is whether you are courageous or simply foolhardy. Either way, it's becoming an inconvenience. If you're finding our interactions inconvenient, there's a simple solution. Leave Ridgewood. Find another clinic for your operation." Stone chuckled. "Direct indeed, but that's not how this works. We've invested time and resources in this location. The geographic position is ideal for our distribution network. The local law enforcement is minimal. Yet you've encountered resistance." "Two options," Stone said, raising one finger. "First, you agree to our original proposal. The clinic becomes a distribution point. You maintain your position as head nurse, continue serving the community, and receive substantial compensation for your cooperation." He raised a second finger. "Alternatively, you resign effective immediately. Leave Ridgewood today, never return. We'll ensure a replacement nurse is provided for the clinic's legitimate operations. And if I choose neither option," Stone's expression hardened, "there is no third option, Nurse Wilson. Not one you'd find palatable." Margaret allowed a moment of silence to stretch between them. "I have a counter-proposal." Stone raised an eyebrow, clearly humoring her. "I'm listening. Will you and your men leave Ridgewood permanently? Cease targeting rural medical facilities for your operation. Return to whatever rock you crawled out from under." "Remarkable," he said softly. "You actually believe you're in a position to make demands." "I think," Margaret replied calmly, "that you're used to people cowering before you, to threats and intimidation working in your favor. I think you're unprepared for someone who isn't afraid." Stone's amusement faded, replaced by cold calculation. "By this time tomorrow, we will be operating from this clinic. The only variable is whether you'll be part of that operation, gone from Ridgewood entirely, or becoming an unfortunate local tragedy. Those are your options. Choose wisely." Margaret held his gaze. "I've already chosen." Before Stone could respond, her earpiece crackled with Rachel's urgent voice. "Movement at the rear entrance. They're attempting to breach." The sound of splintering wood confirmed Rachel's warning. Stone's men were forcing the emergency exit. Margaret was already in motion, hand-dropping to the drawer containing the Beretta. Stone's associate by the door reached beneath his jacket, drawing a pistol with practiced speed. Years of training took over. Margaret grabbed the Beretta and dropped to the floor as the first shot shattered the computer monitor where her head had been moments before. She rolled behind the reception desk, coming up in a firing position, just as Stone's bulky associate fired again, wood splintering above her head. "Reynolds' status," Rachel's voice was tense in her ear. "Engaged," Margaret replied tersely, squeezing off 2 rounds at the doorway, forcing Stone's man to take cover. Rear entry 2 tangos armed 30 seconds out. A single rifle shot cracked from outside the building. One of Stone's men at the rear entrance cried out in pain. Rachel, positioned with a clear line of sight to the emergency exit, had just reduced the odds. The second man from the rear entry appeared at the hallway entrance, assault rifle raised. Margaret dropped back behind the desk as rounds tore into the wood. "Nurse Wilson," Stone's voice came from somewhere to her left. "This is your final opportunity. Surrender now or my associate will utilize his full capabilities. The collateral damage to your clinic will be extensive." Reynolds, Rachel's voice was calm in her ear. "I've got a shot on the tango with the rifle. On your signal." Margaret made her decision. "Take it." Another crack from Rachel's rifle. The man with the AR-15 staggered into view at the hallway entrance, weapon clattering to the floor as he clutched his chest and collapsed. "It's over, Stone," Margaret called, maintaining her cover position. "Your men are down. Surrender now, and I'll ensure the wounded receive medical attention." Stone's laugh held no humor. "You continue to surprise me, Nurse Wilson. Or should I call you by your real title? What was it, Lieutenant Captain?" "Your silence is confirmation enough," Stone continued. "So the question becomes, who are you really, Margaret Wilson? What brings a special operations veteran to a backwater town like Ridgewood, pretending to be nothing more than a simple nurse?" Rachel's voice came through the earpiece. "Reynolds, we have a problem. 2 additional vehicles approaching from the east. Tactical formation, ETA 3 minutes." Margaret needed to end this quickly. She instructed Rachel to create a diversion, then centered herself for what came next. 3 seconds later, a deafening explosion shattered the morning as Rachel's prepared diversion C4 explosive placed near the eastern perimeter detonated. The blast was controlled, designed to create maximum noise and confusion without structural damage. In the moment of disorientation that followed, Margaret moved. She launched herself from behind the reception desk directly into the open area. As she had calculated, Stone instinctively emerged from his position to engage the unexpected target, pistol raised. Their eyes met across 15 feet of space. Recognition flashed in Stone's gaze, not just of Margaret as an opponent, but something deeper, more personal. For a fraction of a second, his expression changed from tactical calculation to genuine surprise. That fraction of a second was all Margaret needed. Her first shot caught Stone in the right shoulder, disrupting his aim as he fired. Her second shot hit center mass, driving him back against the wall. "You," he gasped, eyes locked on Margaret's face. "I know you." "Afghanistan, 2007, Kunar Province," Stone managed. "The female unit. They called you Sentinels. I was Force Recon, provided extraction for your team. After the ambush at Korangal," his breathing became more labored. "You were different then. Hair shorter, face harder. But the eyes, I remember those eyes. The mission had gone catastrophically wrong. An ambush. 3 of the Sentinels wounded. Extraction nearly impossible until a Marine Force Recon unit had appeared, creating a corridor for their helicopter to land." "That was you," she whispered. Stone nodded weakly. "Ironic. Saved you, then only to die by your hand now." "Why?" she asked. "Why target these small clinics?" "This goes beyond prescription fraud." "Money laundering," he gasped. "The clinic's perfect cover. Rural locations, cash businesses, minimal oversight." He gripped her wrist. "The man to watch for Eduardo Vega, cartel lieutenant expanding north. If he takes over small towns like this, they'll never recover." "Reynolds," Rachel appeared at the shattered rear entrance. "Vehicles approaching. We need to go." Despite everything, Margaret applied a field dressing to Stone's chest wound. "There's a flash drive, hidden inside the Suburban's glove compartment behind the manual. Everything's there, names, locations, accounts." "Rest easy, Marine," Margaret said softly. "I'll take it from here." Together they moved swiftly through the shattered emergency exit. As they ran, Margaret could hear the approaching vehicles, the screech of tires, the slam of car doors, shouted commands in Spanish. The cartel Stone had warned about was arriving, unaware that their competitor was already neutralized. The battle for Ridgewood was just beginning, and Margaret Wilson, nurse, widow, former Sentinel, was about to fight for more than just her clinic. She was fighting for her home. The Jeep Cherokee bounced along the fire road, kicking up dust that hung in the Nevada air like a copper veil. Margaret stared through the windshield, her mind already mapping out next steps, even as her body processed the adrenaline crash that followed combat. "We need a secure location," Rachel said, hands steady on the wheel as she navigated the rough terrain. "Somewhere to regroup before we attempt to recover that flash drive." Margaret nodded. "There's an old hunting cabin about 5 miles north of my property. Robert's uncle used it before he passed. Nobody's been there in years, except me." Rachel glanced at her former teammate. "You maintain it." "I check on it every few months, keep it stocked with basics, food, water, medical supplies." Margaret paused. "And other necessities." Rachel understood immediately. "A fallback position. You never really left the life behind, did you?" Margaret gazed out at the rugged landscape. "Old habits." The cabin appeared as they crested a small rise nestled against a rocky outcropping that provided natural cover from three sides. It was small but solidly built riverstone foundation, log walls weathered to a silvery gray metal roof that had held fast against decades of Nevada winters. Inside the cabin was Spartan but functional. A wood stove dominated one wall, flanked by shelves stocked with canned goods and bottled water. A rough-hewn table and chairs occupied the center of the main room, while a narrow cot stood against the far wall. Margaret moved directly to a battered trunk beside the cot, unlocking it with a key from her pocket. Inside lay an impressive array of tactical equipment, handheld radios, night vision goggles, ammunition, and a satellite phone newer than the one from her attic. "You've been busy," Rachel observed, setting her rifle against the wall. "After Robert died, I needed—" Margaret paused, searching for the right words. "Insurance. Something to fall back on if the world went sideways again. And now it has." Margaret's lips tightened into a grim line. "Now it has." The Bluebird Diner's neon sign cast a soft blue glow across Main Street as evening settled over Ridgewood. Inside the jukebox played Creedence Clearwater Revival's "Fortunate Son," the familiar lyrics about war and privilege floating through the half-empty establishment. Margaret and Rachel sat in the rear booth, coffee cups providing cover for their intense conversation. To the casual observer, they were just two women catching up, not former special operators planning a counteroffensive. "Vega's people have taken over the clinic," Rachel said quietly. "My sources say they are using it as a forward operating base while they secure the town." "And Stone?" "No confirmation yet. My guess is they've either taken him as a prisoner or he's already dead." Margaret absorbed this. Despite everything, the thought of Stone dying bothered her. The man had saved her life once in another world, another war. "What about Frank? Any word?" Rachel nodded. "He responded to the clinic with 2 deputies. They were driven back by superior firepower. Frank's smart enough to know when he's outmatched. He's established a perimeter around the town center and called in state police." "Who won't arrive for hours," Margaret noted. "Exactly, which gives us a window to recover that flash drive." The bell above the diner door chimed. Both women tensed slightly, hands instinctively moving toward concealed weapons. A man in his 70s entered, tall and lean, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent a lifetime under the Nevada sun. He wore a flannel shirt and worn jeans, a baseball cap emblazoned with U.S. Marines, pulled low over steel gray hair. "Bill Thompson," Margaret murmured, "owns the gun shop on Cedar Street." Bill's eyes scanned the diner, settling on their booth. With a slight nod, he approached, sliding into the seat beside Rachel. "Evening, Margaret," he said, voice gravelly from decades of cigarettes. "Heard you had some excitement at the clinic today." "Word travels fast," Margaret replied. Bill snorted. "Small town. Gunfire tends to get noticed." He glanced at Rachel. "Don't believe we've met." "Rachel Torres, old friend of Margaret's." Bill's weathered face revealed nothing but his eyes, sharp despite his age, assessed Rachel with the practiced gaze of a former Marine. "Military?" he asked simply. Rachel nodded once. "Thought so. You carry yourself like someone who's seen action." The waitress approached, but Bill waved her off. "Not staying long." He turned back to Margaret. "Frank asked me to find you. Said you might need some specialized inventory." Margaret studied him carefully. "Did he now?" Bill leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Look, I don't know what kind of hornet's nest you kicked, but those men at the clinic aren't ordinary criminals. I recognize professional operators when I see them." "How would you know?" Rachel asked, tension evident in her voice. 30 years Marine Corps. Force recon. 2 tours in Vietnam, 1 in Beirut, consultant work. After that, I'm not at liberty to discuss. Bill's eyes hardened. I know operators when I see them, and I know Stone. Margaret's breath caught. You know Michael Stone? Trained him back in '90, Desert Storm preparation. Good Marine, maybe too good. The kind who sees the world in black and white. Rules of engagement were suggestions to him. He's running a drug operation through rural clinics, Rachel said bluntly. Bill nodded unsurprised. Figures. Stone always had a talent for logistics and personnel management. And a problem with authority. He glanced toward the window. But these new players, the ones at the clinic now, they're something else. Mexican cartel, if I had to guess. What did Frank tell you exactly? Margaret asked. That you might need equipment that isn't available through standard channels. That you're the only chance this town has before those animals dig in and turn Ridgewood into another Millwood. What happened in Millwood? Rachel asked sharply. Bill's expression darkened. 3 overdose deaths last month. Young kids. Town marshal found with a bullet in his head, ruled suicide. The clinic there prescribing oxy like it's candy. Margaret and Rachel exchanged glances. This matched what they knew about Stone's operation, but suggested the problem was already more advanced than they'd realized. What can you offer? Margaret asked. Bill slid a piece of paper across the table. My shop 1 hour. Back entrance. I'll have everything on this list ready. He stood adjusting his cap. And Margaret Frank said to tell you he's got 5 men you can trust. Vietnam vets, all of them. Still know which end of a rifle is which. After Bill left, Rachel scanned the list. M4 carbines, Remington 870 shotguns, body armor, night vision. Your small-town gun shop carries all this? Margaret allowed herself a small smile. Bill caters to a specific clientele, ex-military mostly, the kind who like to be prepared. For what? The apocalypse. For nights like tonight, net. Dr. James Preston's house sat on 3 acres at the edge of town, a modest ranch-style home partially hidden by cottonwood trees. Margaret and Rachel approached cautiously, alert for surveillance. You're sure we can trust him? Rachel asked as they neared the back door. James served as a combat medic in Desert Storm. Saved more lives than he can count. If there's anyone in this town with both the skills and the moral compass we need, it's him. Dr. Preston answered their knock immediately as if he'd been waiting by the door. At 58, he retained the ramrod straight posture of his military days, though his salt and pepper beard and wire-rimmed glasses gave him a scholarly appearance. Margaret, he said, relief evident in his voice. Thank God, I've been worried sick. His eyes shifted to Rachel. You must be the backup. Rachel Torres. She introduced herself as he ushered them inside. The doctor's living room had been transformed into a makeshift command center. Maps of Ridgewood and the surrounding area were spread across the dining table. A police scanner crackled in the corner. Frank dropped these off, Preston explained, gesturing to the maps. Said you might need them. Ellen Matthews emerged from the kitchen, carrying a tray of coffee. At 65, the head nurse moved with the efficiency of someone who had spent decades in emergency rooms. Margaret Wilson, she scolded, setting down the tray. I've half a mind to strangle you for not telling me what was really happening at our clinic. Margaret accepted the coffee with a grateful nod. I was trying to protect you, Ellen. Protect me? Ellen snorted. I was an Army nurse in Saigon 1968. I've seen worse than these thugs. A man rose from an armchair in the corner, Carl Jenkins, the clinic's security guard. At 65, he maintained the solid build and watchful eyes of his 30 years in law enforcement. Those aren't ordinary thugs, he said gravely. I counted at least 8 men at the clinic, all armed with military-grade weapons. They've established a perimeter and have lookouts on the roof. This is a professional operation. They're cartel enforcers, Rachel confirmed. Vega's people moving north from Mexico, taking over Stone's network. Stone, Jenkins spat the name. Never trusted that smooth-talking SOB from the moment he walked into the clinic. Margaret turned to Dr. Preston. James, we need to know everything you can tell us about the clinic's layout. Blind spots, structural weaknesses, anything that wouldn't be on the building plans. The doctor nodded, moving to the table. The original bank vault, we use it for medical supplies now. The walls are 18 inches of reinforced concrete. The door is steel, but the combination lock was replaced with a standard deadbolt years ago. Potential strong point, Rachel noted, making a mark on the map. There's also a maintenance tunnel that runs beneath the building, Preston continued. Part of the original construction, access is through a trapdoor in the storage closet. Leads out to an outlet about 50 yards behind the building. Margaret raised an eyebrow. You never mentioned this before. Preston shrugged. Never seemed relevant. It's been sealed for years, building code violation. But the access panel is just screwed shut. Could be opened easily enough. Potential infiltration route, Rachel said, marking another spot. As they continued discussing the clinic's layout, a knock at the back door silenced the room. Jenkins moved swiftly to the window, peering through the blinds. It's Frank, he reported, relief evident in his voice. The sheriff entered, looking haggard but resolute. He was accompanied by a man Margaret didn't recognize, tall around 50, with the lean build and alert eyes of a professional operator. Margaret, Rachel. Frank nodded to them. This is John Harrison, says he knows you, Rachel. Rachel's eyes narrowed. We've never met. The man smiled thinly. Not officially, no, but I've read your file, Agent Torres. Impressive work with the HRT before your retirement. DEA, Rachel asked, her voice tight. Harrison nodded. Special agent in charge, Nevada Tactical Diversion Squad. I've been tracking Stone's operation for 18 months. Margaret studied Harrison carefully. You've been in Ridgewood. Why didn't you stop this before it escalated? I arrived 3 days ago based on intelligence that Stone was expanding operations here. I was supposed to observe and report, not engage. My cover was as a bird watcher staying at the inn. His expression hardened. Then you two started a small war in the middle of Main Street. Those men attacked us, Margaret countered. Harrison raised his hands in a placating gesture. I'm not here to point fingers. What's done is done. Now we need to work together to contain the situation before it gets worse. How much worse can it get? Ellen asked. They've taken over our clinic. Much worse, Harrison said grimly. Vega isn't just another cartel lieutenant. He's ex-Mexican Special Forces trained at Fort Benning. He's been systematically taking over rural communities across the Southwest, using them as distribution hubs. Millwood fell 6 months ago. 3 more towns in Eastern California before that. Frank cursed softly, and nobody stopped him. These operations are designed to stay below federal radar. Small towns, isolated communities, minimal law enforcement presence. By the time we identify a pattern, they're already entrenched. Local officials are either bought off, intimidated, or eliminated. A heavy silence fell over the room as the implications sank in. What about Stone? Margaret finally asked. Where does he fit in all this? Harrison's expression shifted, revealing a flicker of what might have been compassion. Michael Stone was one of the best force recon Marines of his generation. Distinguished service in multiple theaters. Then his daughter died of an oxycodone overdose in 2014, prescription from a pain clinic in San Diego. And he responded by starting his own drug operation, Ellen asked incredulously. Not exactly. At first he targeted the doctors and clinics responsible for overprescribing. Vigilante justice. Somewhere along the way he realized there was money to be made and that he could control the distribution, make it safer. His operation doesn't sell to kids, doesn't cut product with fentanyl. Honor among thieves, Frank muttered. More like a twisted code, Harrison corrected. Stone believes he's bringing order to chaos, military discipline to an undisciplined business. Margaret absorbed this new information, reconciling it with the man she'd confronted at the clinic. It made a twisted kind of sense, Stone's precision, his tactical approach, his apparent lack of sadistic tendencies. What about Robert? She asked quietly. My husband's death was that Stone, Harrison, and Frank exchanged glances. We don't know for certain, Frank said carefully, but the timing fits. Robert had been investigating a series of unusual prescriptions from clinics in neighboring counties. He was getting close to connecting the dots. The official report says routine traffic stop gone wrong, Harrison added. But the shooter, Luis Martinez, had no history of violence. Small-time dealer who suddenly decides to shoot a deputy at point-blank range never added up. Margaret felt as if the floor had dropped from beneath her. 7 years of grief based on a lie. 7 years believing her husband had died in a random act of violence, when all along it had been a calculated execution. I need air, she said abruptly, moving toward the back door. Outside, the desert night had cooled considerably, stars blanketing the sky in brilliant clarity. Margaret leaned against the porch railing, breath forming small clouds in the chill air. The door opened behind her. Frank stepped out, settling his lanky frame beside her at the railing. "I should have told you sooner," he said quietly, "about my suspicions regarding Robert's death." "Why didn't you?" Frank sighed, the sound heavy with regret. "At first I didn't have anything concrete, just a gut feeling that something wasn't right. By the time I started connecting the dots, you were recovering, finding your footing again. I didn't want to reopen that wound without absolute certainty." Margaret was silent for a long moment. "All these years I've been living in the same town as the people responsible for killing my husband. We don't know that Stone personally ordered the hit," Frank cautioned. "Does it matter? It was his organization, his operation." She turned to face him. "Tell me something, Frank. Did Robert know about my background, my military service?" Frank looked surprised by the question. "He knew you'd served, said you didn't talk about it much, respected your privacy on it." He paused. "Though I suspected there was more to it than you let on. The way you carry yourself, how you're always aware of your surroundings, the way you place yourself in a room, those aren't things you unlearn." Margaret nodded slowly. "I was part of a classified unit, female operators deployed for missions that required our specific skill set. The Sentinels, we called ourselves." Frank's expression remained neutral, but his eyes registered understanding. "Special operations. That explains a few things. I left that life behind when I met Robert. Or I thought I did." Margaret looked up at the stars. "I promised myself that I was done with violence, that I'd found peace here. And now," Margaret's expression hardened, "now I know that peace was built on a lie, that the man I loved was murdered because he was doing his job, that the people responsible are still out there, still hurting communities like ours." Frank studied her carefully. "What are you planning, Margaret?" "I'm planning to finish what Robert started, to stop Stone's operation and Vega's cartel from destroying any more lives." She turned to face him fully. "But I need to know if you're with me, Frank, all the way." The old sheriff straightened shoulders, squaring with resolve. "Robert was like a son to me. This town is my responsibility. If stopping these bastards means bending a few rules, well, I've got less than a year until retirement anyway." Margaret allowed herself a small, grim smile. "We'll need more than just us." "I've got 5 men inside," Frank said. "Vietnam vets, all of them. Joe Wilson was Force Recon. Steve Carter flew Huey's. Mike Reynolds was 101st Airborne. They're old, but they know what they're doing. Bill Thompson." Frank nodded. "Bill's coordinating equipment. The others are already positioned around town, keeping eyes on Vega's men." Margaret felt a surge of gratitude for these aging warriors still willing to stand against evil, despite the years behind them. "Let's get back inside," she said. "We have a lot to plan before dawn." The strategy session continued well into the night. Maps were marked, contingencies discussed, resources allocated. John Harrison provided detailed intelligence on Vega's tactics and personnel. Der Preston outlined medical preparations for potential casualties. Ellen and Carl offered insights on the clinic's daily operations that might provide tactical advantages. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Rachel pulled Margaret aside. "We need to talk," she said quietly, leading Margaret to the far corner of the living room. "There's something you should know about the Sentinels." Margaret tensed at her teammate's serious tone. "What is it?" Rachel glanced around, ensuring they wouldn't be overheard. "I didn't want to say this in front of the others. It's about Lisa Montgomery." "Lisa? What about her?" "She's been working with Stone." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. "That's not possible. Lisa would never." "I saw the intelligence reports myself just before I left the Bureau. Lisa was identified meeting with Stone in Carson City last year. The surveillance photos were unmistakable." Margaret shook her head in disbelief. "There must be some explanation. Maybe she was undercover." "She wasn't on any official assignment," Rachel cut in. "I checked every database, called in every favor. This was off the books." "Why would she do that? After everything we went through together?" Rachel's expression softened. "I don't know, but it explains how Stone knew to find you here, how he recognized you so quickly." The implications crashed over Margaret in waves. Lisa Montgomery, one of her closest friends from the unit, betraying not just their friendship, but potentially exposing Margaret's carefully constructed civilian identity. We need to focus on the mission at hand, Rachel said gently but firmly, bringing Margaret back to the present. Deal with Lisa later. Margaret nodded, compartmentalizing her emotions as she'd been trained to do. You're right, the flash drive is our priority. They rejoined the group around the table where Harrison was outlining his observations of Vega's men. They're rotating guards every 4 hours. 2 men on the roof, 3 at ground level. The rest appear to be inside the clinic. My best estimate is 12 to 15 operators total. Any sign of Stone? Margaret asked. Harrison shook his head. No visual confirmation since the initial confrontation. If he's still alive, he's being held inside. Frank pointed to the map. Bill's shop is here. He's prepared a cache of weapons and equipment. The problem is getting to it without being spotted by Vega's lookouts. The sewers, Carl suggested. Ridgewood's old enough to have a proper storm drain system. Runs right past Bill's shop. Access point, Rachel asked. Maintenance hatch behind the hardware store. I've got the key. Town maintenance used to be part of my deputy duties before I retired. Margaret nodded. That could work. Rachel and I can move through the sewers, secure the equipment, then rendezvous with Frank's men here. She indicated a point on the map, an abandoned gas station at the edge of town. And then, Dr. Preston asked. And then we implement the main operation, Margaret replied. Rachel, Harrison, and I will infiltrate the clinic through the maintenance tunnel Dr. Preston mentioned. Our primary objective is to recover the flash drive from Stone's vehicle. Secondary objective is to assess the situation inside the clinic and, if possible, extract Stone for questioning. Meanwhile, Frank continued, my team will create a diversion here on the opposite side of town. Make Vega think we're mounting a frontal assault with what limited resources we have. What about civilian protection? Ellen asked Ever the nurse. Carl and Dr. Stone. Preston will coordinate evacuation of any residents in the potential combat zone. Margaret answered. The community center on Oak Street should be far enough away to serve as a safe house. Harrison studied the plan with a professional eye. It's risky, a lot of moving parts. You have a better idea, Rachel challenged. No, he admitted. But even if we succeed, we're talking about a temporary victory at best. Vega has resources we can't match. He'll send reinforcements. We don't need to defeat his entire organization, Margaret countered. We just need to secure that flash drive and hold out until federal backup arrives. And if Stone's already given up the location of the drive under interrogation, Harrison asked. The question hung in the air unanswered. We proceed as planned, Margaret finally said. If the drive is gone, we adapt. Either way, we can't allow Vega to establish a foothold in Ridgewood. As the others continued discussing details, Frank pulled Margaret aside. There's something else you should know, he said quietly. About Stone. He was in Ridgewood once before, about 8 years ago. Just passing through, stopped at the Bluebird for lunch. Robert was there too. Margaret frowned. Robert never mentioned meeting Stone. That's just it, they didn't meet exactly. Robert noticed him because of his military bearing. Told me later he had a feeling about the guy something off. Said he was going to run the plates on Stone's vehicle, just as a precaution. A week before he died. Margaret realized the pieces clicking into place. Frank nodded grimly. I think that's what started it all. Robert noticing Stone making him nervous enough to run a check. It might have been enough to trigger Stone's paranoia, make him think Robert was onto his operation. The revelation settled over Margaret like a cold weight. Such a small thing. Her husband's instinctive caution, his good cop's intuition setting in motion the events that would lead to his death. Thank you for telling me, she said quietly. Frank squeezed her shoulder gently. Robert would be proud of what you're doing now, standing up for this town for what's right. Margaret wasn't so sure. Robert had loved her gentle side, the part of her that had embraced small-town life and nursing. What would he think of the warrior re-emerging, the sentinel, taking up arms once more? But those questions would have to wait. Dawn was approaching, and with it the beginning of their operation. Everyone get some rest, Margaret announced to the group. We move in 4 hours. The storm drain system beneath Ridgewood was a cramped, dank reminder of the town's earlier prosperity. Built in the 1950s when silver mining brought unexpected wealth, the concrete tunnels were now rarely maintained, serving mainly to channel the infrequent but sometimes violent desert rainstorms. Margaret and Rachel moved through the gloom with tactical lights affixed to their clothing, not their weapons, keeping their hands free. The air was stale with occasional pockets of methane that made breathing unpleasant. Just like Fallujah, Rachel muttered, ducking beneath a low-hanging pipe. Except without the IEDs, Margaret replied. They reached the access point beneath Bill Thompson's gun shop without incident. 3 sharp taps on the ceiling hatch brought an immediate response, the scrape of metal as the cover was moved aside. Bill's weathered face appeared in the opening. Right on time. Come on up. The shop's basement was meticulously organized with racks of weapons and equipment that would have impressed many military armories. Bill had laid out their requested items on a central table: 2 M4 carbines with suppressors, Remington 870 shotguns, Beretta 92 pistols, body armor, and tactical gear. Desert Storm era, Bill explained, gesturing to the equipment. Kept it all in working condition, though. Oil changed regularly, firing pins checked the works. Margaret inspected one of the M4s, finding it immaculately maintained. This isn't exactly standard gun shop inventory, Bill. The old Marine shrugged. Let's just say I've been preparing for a rainy day for a long time. Never thought the storm would be something like this, though. As they geared up, a radio on Bill's workbench crackled to life. Thompson, this is Miller. You copy? Bill snatched up the handset. Copy, Sheriff. Go ahead. We've got movement at the clinic. 3 vehicles just arrived. Looks like reinforcements. Margaret and Rachel exchanged glances. This complicated matters. How many? Margaret asked, taking the radio. At least 10 new tangos, Frank replied, using the military term for targets. Well-armed, moving with purpose. Definitely professionals. Any sign of who's in charge? A pause, then negative. Wait, scratch that. I've got visual on a new player. Male, mid-40s, expensive suit. The others are deferring to him. Vega, Harrison's voice cut in from another channel. I recognize the description. Eduardo Vega himself is on site. This just got a lot more serious. Margaret absorbed this new information. If Vega was personally supervising the Ridgewood operation, it suggested the situation was even more significant than they'd realized. Any change to the plan? Frank asked. Margaret considered for a moment. No, we proceed as scheduled, but be advised these new tangos are likely Vega's elite security team. Expect higher skill levels than the advanced force. Copy that, Frank acknowledged. Miller out. As they finished preparing, Bill handed Margaret a small package wrapped in oilcloth. Little something extra, he said. Thermite charges, military grade. Figured you might need to destroy evidence or create a diversion. Margaret accepted the package with a nod of thanks. You seem awfully prepared for this kind of situation, Bill. The old Marine's eyes took on a distant look. After Vietnam, I swore I'd never be caught unprepared again. Saw too many good men die because we didn't have the right equipment at the right time. He paused. Robert understood. He used to come shooting with me sometimes. Good man. Deserved better than what happened to him. Yes, Margaret agreed softly. He did. Fully equipped, they prepared to depart. Bill would remain at the shop, coordinating communications between the different teams. Be careful down there, he cautioned as they prepared to re-enter the storm drain. Those tunnels can be treacherous after a rain. We had a downpour 2 days ago. We'll manage, Rachel assured him. We've operated in worse conditions. As they moved through the tunnels toward their rendezvous point, Margaret's mind kept returning to the revelation about Lisa Montgomery. The betrayal stung deeply, but also raised questions. Why would Lisa work with Stone? What could he offer that would make her betray not just her former team, but the very principles they had fought to uphold? You're thinking about Lisa, Rachel observed as they navigated a particularly narrow section of tunnel. Wouldn't you be? I've had longer to process it, Rachel admitted. Found out about 6 months ago. Couldn't believe it at first. Did you confront her? Tried to. She disappeared. Gone to ground. Her apartment cleaned out. Phone disconnected. Margaret frowned. That doesn't sound like someone who betrayed us for money or power. That sounds like someone running scared. Rachel considered this. You think she was coerced? I don't know, but Lisa was one of the most dedicated among us. Whatever happened, there's more to the story. They fell silent as they approached the rendezvous point. The storm drain widened into a collection chamber where multiple tunnels converged. According to the old city plans, Carl had provided this chamber sat directly beneath the abandoned gas station where Frank's men would be waiting. As they prepared to ascend, Rachel gripped Margaret's arm. Listen. Margaret went still, straining her ears. At first she heard only the drip of water and their own breathing. Then voices, male voices speaking rapid Spanish coming from one of the connecting tunnels. Vega's men, Rachel whispered. They're in the tunnels. This was an unexpected complication. If Vega's forces were already using the storm drains, their entire infiltration plan was compromised. Margaret signaled for Rachel to hold position, then crept forward to the junction where the voices originated. Peering carefully around the corner, she counted 3 men moving slowly through the tunnel, weapons ready, tactical lights sweeping the concrete walls. They were conducting a systematic sweep of the underground network, exactly what Margaret would have ordered in Vega's position. It suggested that someone with military training was directing their operations, perhaps Vega himself. She retreated silently to Rachel's position. 3 tangos, 30 meters heading this way. We need to move now. They ascended the access ladder quickly but quietly, Rachel leading, Margaret covering their rear. The access hatch at the top was secured with a rusted padlock, which Rachel made short work of using a small set of bolt cutters from her gear. The abandoned gas station above was dim, illuminated only by the shafts of sunlight penetrating the dust-covered windows. 5 men waited inside, positioned strategically around the perimeter. Despite their age, all in their 60s or 70s, they moved with the purpose and awareness of trained combatants. Frank stepped forward to meet them. Everyone's in position. Harrison reports Vega's men have established a secure perimeter around the clinic. At least 20 operators now, possibly more inside. They're in the tunnels too, Margaret reported. At least 3 that we saw. Likely more. This news clearly concerned Frank. That changes things. The maintenance tunnel to the clinic may already be compromised, Margaret finished. We need a new infiltration route. The oldest of Frank's men stepped forward, Steve Carter, former Huey pilot in Vietnam. At 72, his face was deeply lined, but his eyes remained sharp beneath bushy white eyebrows. What about from above, he suggested. I've still got my pilot's license. Got a Bell 206 Jet Ranger at my ranch outside town. Could put you on the roof, fast rope insertion. Rachel shook her head. Too exposed. They'd see us coming from miles away. Not if we time it right, Steve countered. There's a storm front moving in from the west. Visibility's already dropping. By noon, we'll have cloud cover down to about 500 feet. Fly in low from the east, pop up over the building, drop you on the roof, and be gone before they can react. Margaret considered the proposal. It was risky, but with the tunnels compromised, their options were limited. How long since you've flown in combat conditions? She asked. Steve's weathered face broke into a grin. Who says I ever stopped? Been flying fire suppression contracts for the Forest Service every summer for 20 years. Dropping into smoke and flame makes a hot LZ in Nam look like a Sunday picnic. Frank nodded in agreement. Steve's the best pilot I've ever known. If he says he can do it, he can do it. All right, Margaret decided. We adjust the plan. Rachel, Harrison, and I insert via helicopter. Frank's team still creates the diversion, but delays until we signal ready position. As they began modifying their strategy, Harrison's voice came through on the radio. All teams be advised. We have a situation at the clinic. Stone has been moved outside. Repeat, Stone is now visible on the south side of the building. Margaret grabbed the radio. What's his condition? Alive, but looks like he's been worked over pretty good. They've got him on his knees in the parking lot. Vega's standing in front of him. Execution, Frank asked grimly. Negative, looks more like an interrogation. Very public. They want the town to see it. Margaret's mind raced. This changed everything. If Vega was publicly interrogating Stone, it suggested he hadn't yet obtained the information he wanted, likely the location of the flash drive. They don't have the drive, she realized aloud. They're trying to make Stone talk. Which means we still have a chance to recover it, Rachel added. Or, Frank countered, they already know where it is and are putting on a show while they retrieve it. Harrison's voice cut through their speculation. Update, Vega just put a gun to Stone's head. Looks like the interrogation didn't go well. Margaret made a split-second decision. All teams execute diversionary plan now. Repeat, execute now. Frank was already in motion, directing his men to their vehicles. What about the helicopter insertion? No time, Margaret replied, checking her weapon. Rachel and I will use the original tunnel plan. The diversion should pull enough of Vega's men away from the clinic to give us a chance. And if the tunnels are compromised, Rachel asked. Margaret's expression hardened. Then we fight our way through. As the teams moved to their positions, Margaret found herself driven by more than just the mission parameters. Stone may have been involved in Robert's death, but he also held the key to bringing down both criminal networks. And somewhere deep in her warrior's code, there remained the debt of honor Stone had once saved her life in Kunar province. That counted for something even now. Let's move, she ordered. They descended back into the darkness of the storm drains, weapons ready, moving toward what promised to be the most dangerous confrontation of their lives. The first explosion shook the western edge of Ridgewood with concussive force, a plume of black smoke rising into the Nevada sky. Seconds later, a second blast erupted from the abandoned gas station. Frank Miller's diversion was underway right on schedule. Margaret and Rachel crouched in the storm drain beneath Main Street, listening to the chaos unfolding above. Through their earpieces came the coordinated chatter of Frank's team Vietnam veterans executing a tactical withdrawal designed to draw Vega's forces away from the clinic. They're moving, John Harrison reported from his observation post. 2 vehicles, at least 8 men heading toward the explosions. Margaret checked her watch. That leaves approximately 12 tangos at the clinic. Still heavy odds. I've seen worse, Rachel said, checking her M4 one last time. They had navigated through the storm drain system, carefully avoiding the patrols they had encountered earlier. Now they waited beneath an access point just 50 yards from the clinic's rear entrance. What about Stone? Margaret asked into her comm. Still outside south side of the building, Harrison replied. Vega moved back inside when the explosion started. Left 2 guards with Stone. Margaret processed this information. The diversion worked partially. Vega's divided his forces, but he's still holding the clinic with significant manpower. We stick to the plan, Rachel insisted. Get and secure the flash drive, assess Stone's situation, then extract. Margaret nodded. Harrison, what's your position? Rooftop overlooking the clinic from the east. I have overwatch on the entire south parking lot. Prepare to provide covering fire on my mark. We move in 60 seconds. Margaret took a moment to center herself, focusing her mind as she had countless times before combat. The tactical part of her brain calculated angles, distances, potential threats. But beneath that cold precision ran a current of something more personal, the knowledge that she was close to uncovering the truth about Robert's death, perhaps even confronting those responsible. Ready? Rachel asked. Always. They ascended the ladder, swiftly emerging behind a dumpster in the alley that ran behind Western Drug. The clinic was visible across the employee parking lot, its brick facade mundane and unassuming, a stark contrast to the armed men now patrolling its perimeter. Margaret activated her comm. Harrison status on south side guards. 2 tangos, AR platform weapons positioned at 2 and 10 o'clock relative to Stone. Stone is seated, hands bound behind him, appears conscious but injured. Copy. On my mark, take the guard at 2 o'clock. I'll handle 10 o'clock. Understood. I have the shot. Margaret and Rachel moved silently across the parking lot using vehicles for cover. The maintenance tunnel access point was located behind an HVAC unit on the clinic's east side, a blind spot in the building's security cameras, according to Dr. Preston's information. As they reached position, Margaret raised her rifle, sighting down its length at the guard positioned at Stone's 10 o'clock. Through her scope, she could see Stone clearly for the first time since their confrontation inside the clinic. His face was bruised, one eye swollen shut, dried blood caking his silver hair. Despite his injuries, he maintained the rigid posture of a Marine, even bound and on his knees. Execute, Margaret whispered. 2 shots cracked, and almost simultaneously, Harrison's from the rooftop and Margaret's from her position. Both guards dropped without a sound, suppressors having muffled the rifle reports. Stone's head snapped up, eyes scanning for the source of his unexpected reprieve. His gaze locked with Margaret's across the parking lot, recognition evident even at this distance. Rachel, secure the tunnel entrance, Margaret ordered. I'll get Stone. Too exposed, Rachel objected. We stick to the plan, the drive first. No time to argue. The drive is useless if Vega moves it before we can reach the vehicle. Stone can tell us exactly where it is. Before Rachel could protest further, Margaret was moving, staying low, and using parked cars for concealment as she approached Stone's position. She reached him in seconds, knife already drawn to cut his bonds. "You've got terrible timing, Reynolds." Stone rasped, his voice rough from what had likely been hours of interrogation. They were just about to serve lunch. Despite everything, Margaret felt a flicker of grudging respect for the man's defiance. "Can you walk by? I can run if it gets me away from these psychopaths." She cut the zip ties binding his wrists, noting the deep abrasions where he'd clearly been struggling against them. "The flash drive, is it still in the Suburban?" Stone nodded, rubbing circulation back into his hands. "Glove compartment behind the owner's manual. But Vega's men have been searching the vehicle. Did they find it?" "Not yet. They were interrupted by your team's fireworks display." Stone's eyes narrowed. "You're not alone in this. Are you military precision on those shots?" "Save the questions for later," Margaret said, handing him a pistol from her thigh holster. "We need to move. Now." They rejoined Rachel at the maintenance tunnel entrance, a rusted metal hatch set into the ground behind the HVAC unit. She had already opened it, revealing a narrow passage descending into darkness. "Stone," Rachel acknowledged coldly. "You look like hell." "Feelings mutual, Torres," he replied, recognizing her immediately. "The whole gang back together again." "Just us," Margaret cut in. "Harrison status?" "Clear for now," came the reply through their comms. "But I'm seeing movement inside the clinic. They've noticed the missing guards. You've got maybe 2 minutes before they sound a general alarm." "Copy. We're proceeding to the target vehicle." The three of them moved toward the clinic's south parking lot, where Stone's Suburban remained parked, now surrounded by crime scene tape Vega's men had established. 2 guards patrolled nearby, but their attention was focused outward toward the continuing sounds of gunfire from Frank's diversion. "I'll create a distraction," Rachel said, removing one of Bill Thompson's thermite charges from her pack. "You two secure the drive." Margaret nodded. 30 seconds. Rachel disappeared around the corner of the building. Moments later, a bright flash and pillar of intense white flame erupted from the clinic's dumpster area, accompanied by the distinctive sizzle of military-grade thermite. The guards reacted immediately, running toward the new threat. Margaret and Stone seized the opportunity, sprinting to the Suburban. Stone went directly to the passenger side, opening the glove compartment and reaching behind the vehicle manual. His hand emerged, clutching a small USB drive. "Got it," he confirmed. Margaret's comm crackled. "Multiple tangos moving your way," Harrison warned. "At least 6 heavily armed. You need to extract now." "Rachel's status," Margaret calls into her comm. "Pinned down on the east side," came the tensive reply, punctuated by the sound of gunfire. "Don't wait for me. I'll find my own way out." "Negative. We extract together." Margaret calculated rapidly. The maintenance tunnel was now cut off by the approaching hostiles. The storm drains were likely still patrolled. They needed an alternative. "Harrison, we need an extraction point. South side no longer viable." "North side," Harrison replied immediately. "Service road behind the pharmacy. I have a vehicle staged there. Can you reach it?" Margaret glanced at Stone, assessing his condition. Despite his injuries, the former Force Recon Marine seemed to have found his second wind adrenaline overriding pain. "Affirmative. What about Rachel?" "I'll guide her to the same point. Different route." "Copy. Moving now." They skirted the edge of the parking lot, staying in the shadows of the surrounding buildings. The sound of gunfire had intensified both from Frank's diversion and from Rachel's position. Vega's men were fully engaged now, their disciplined response suggesting experienced combat personnel. As they reached the narrow alley that would lead them to the service road, Stone suddenly pulled Margaret into a recessed doorway, pressing them both against the wall as a patrol of 3 men passed by, less than 10 feet away. They spoke rapid Spanish weapons at the ready, moving with the coordinated precision of Special Forces operators. When they had passed, Stone released her. "Vega's elite team," he whispered. "Ex-Mexican Special Forces, very good at their job." "How do you know?" "I trained some of them back when they were still on our side." They continued through the alley, eventually emerging onto the service road, where a nondescript panel van waited, engine running. Harrison sat behind the wheel, gesturing urgently for them to get in. "Where's Rachel?" Margaret demanded as they climbed aboard. "Still extracting," Harrison replied, putting the van in gear. "She's taken a different route, said she'd rendezvous at the fallback position." Margaret frowned, not liking the separation, but there was no time to argue. The van accelerated down the service road, away from the clinic and the sounds of conflict. "The drive?" Harrison said, extending his hand toward Stone. Stone hesitated, looking to Margaret. Give it to him, she confirmed. He's DEA. Stone handed over the USB drive, but his expression remained guarded. I don't recognize you from any inter-agency briefings, Harrison. Special assignment, Harrison replied, pocketing the drive. Come. Deep cover, need-to-know basis. And now the three of us know, Stone observed. Convenient. Margaret caught the suspicion in Stone's tone, but before she could respond, the van swerved violently as a bullet shattered the side mirror. They were being pursued, two black SUVs closing rapidly from behind. Hold on, Harrison shouted, flooring the accelerator. The van lurched forward, engine straining as it raced down the empty service road toward the highway. Harrison drove with surprising skill, executing evasive maneuvers that kept their pursuers from getting a clean shot. I need a weapon, Stone said grimly, bracing himself against the van's interior as it took a sharp turn. Margaret hesitated only briefly before handing him her backup pistol, a Glock 19 she'd taken from Bill Thompson's cache. Try not to shoot me in the back. Stone checked the magazine and chambered around. If I wanted you dead, Reynolds, I'd have done it years ago when I first identified you in Ridgewood. The implication hung between them. Stone had known who she was, had known for years, and had chosen to leave her in peace. Until now. Why did you come after the clinic? Margaret asked, returning fire through the van's rear window as their pursuers closed in. Why now, after all this time? Wasn't personal, Stone grunted, joining her at the window and squeezing off several well-placed shots that forced one of the pursuing vehicles to swerve. Ridgewood was just next on the expansion list. I didn't realize you were there until my advance team identified you. And when they did, Stone's expression hardened. I should have pulled back, changed targets, but the operation was already in motion. The operation that includes murdering police officers who get too close. Margaret's voice was cold. Officers like my husband. Stone's shot went wide, his head snapping toward her. Your husband, the deputy who was killed. That was, a bullet shattered the rear window, completely forcing them both to duck. When they rose to return fire, the pursuing vehicles had closed the gap considerably. We need to get off this road, Harrison called from the driver's seat. There's a turnoff ahead, old mining access road. Might lose them in the hills. The van lurched again as Harrison made a sharp turn onto a dirt track that wound up into the scrub-covered hills east of Ridgewood. The pursuing vehicles followed, kicking up clouds of dust that briefly obscured them from view. Rachel, do you copy? Margaret called into her comm, receiving only static in response. Rachel, report position. Comms are being jammed, Harrison said. Vega's people have electronic warfare capabilities. This mission was unraveling rapidly. Rachel was missing, they were being pursued by cartel forces, and communications were compromised. And there was still the matter of Stone, the man who might have ordered Robert's death yet, who now fought alongside them. The mining road narrowed as it climbed, hemmed in by steep embankments on both sides. Harrison pushed the van to its limits, the suspension groaning in protest as they bounced over the uneven terrain. Choke point ahead, Stone warned, pointing to where the road passed through a narrow gap between two rocky outcroppings. Perfect place for an ambush. Harrison nodded grimly. No choice. We can't turn around. As they approached the gap, Margaret spotted movement on the rocks above, armed figures taking position for an ambush. Contact high, she shouted. The first shots pinged off the van's roof as Harrison floored the accelerator, trying to push through the kill zone before the ambushers could properly target them. Stone leaned out the window, providing suppressing fire to keep the attackers' heads down. They were halfway through the gap when the front tire blew, sending the van into a skid. Harrison fought for control, but the vehicle slammed into the rocky embankment, coming to a violent stop. Out, everyone out, Margaret commanded, grabbing her rifle and kicking open the side door. They spilled from the disabled van, taking cover behind it as bullets rained down from the rocks above. Harrison had been hit, blood seeping from a wound in his upper arm, but he still clutched his weapon. The drive, Margaret said urgently. Secure it. Harrison nodded, patting his pocket to confirm he still had the USB. We need to retreat back down the road. Find another route. Negative, Stone countered. They'll cut us off. Our best option is forward over those rocks. There's a plateau beyond this ridge with better defensive positions. Margaret assessed their situation rapidly. Stone was right, tactically moving forward made more sense than retreating into the arms of their pursuers. But could she trust his judgment, his motivations? Reynolds, Stone said, his voice dropping to a tone only she could hear. I didn't know about your husband. I never authorized a hit on a local deputy. That wasn't how we operated. Margaret searched his face, looking for deception. Instead, she found what appeared to be genuine confusion and concern. Then who did? She demanded. If he was investigating our operation, it could have been... Stone's expression darkened. Vega. He was making inroads even then, placing his people in our network. My organization had rules: no violence against law enforcement unless absolutely necessary. Vega has no such restraints. A fresh barrage of gunfire cut their conversation short. They needed to move. Up and over, Margaret decided. Harrison, can you make the climb? The DEA agent nodded, wincing as he tried to staunch his bleeding arm. I'll manage. I'll go first, create a diversion, Stone offered. You two follow when I give the signal. Margaret hesitated, then nodded. Despite everything, Stone's combat experience and tactical acumen were assets they couldn't afford to reject. Stone checked his weapon, then took a deep breath. Like old times, Reynolds Korangal Valley all over again. Before she could respond, he was moving, sprinting in a zigzag pattern toward the rocks, while firing upward to force the ambushers to take cover. Margaret provided covering fire, her M4 chattering in controlled bursts, as Stone scrambled up the rocky slope with surprising agility for a man who had been tortured just hours before. He reached a protected position halfway up and signaled for them to follow. Margaret grabbed Harrison's good arm, helping him to his feet. Go, she ordered. I'll cover you. Harrison sprinted toward the rocks as Margaret laid down suppressive fire. The ambushers were well trained, however, adjusting their positions to maintain the advantage. As Harrison neared the base of the slope, a shot rang out from a new direction. The pursuing vehicles had caught up their occupants, now joining the fight. Harrison went down, clutching his leg where a bullet had struck him. Margaret immediately moved to his position, returning fire as she dragged him behind a boulder. Drive, he gasped, fumbling in his pocket. Take it. She accepted the USB, securing it in a hidden pocket in her tactical vest. Can you move? Harrison shook his head, face pale from blood loss. Leave me. I'll hold them here, buy you time. Not happening, Margaret said firmly. No one gets left behind. From his position above, Stone had observed the situation. He descended partway, providing covering fire from a different angle, creating confusion among their attackers. Reynolds, he called. There's a route up the east face, less exposed. I'll cover you from here. Margaret assessed Harrison's wounds quickly. The leg wound was serious, but not immediately life-threatening. With support, he might be able to make the climb. On three, she told him, positioning herself to take his weight. 1, 2, 3. They moved as one, Margaret half carrying Harrison as they scrambled toward the eastern face of the rocky outcropping. Stone's covering fire was methodical and precise, forcing the attackers to keep their heads down. They reached the more protected route and began ascending using the natural cover of the rock formation. As they neared the top, a shot rang out from above them. Margaret looked up to see Stone engaged in hand-to-hand combat with one of Vega's men who had circled around behind them. Despite his injuries, Stone fought with brutal efficiency, eventually gaining the upper hand and sending his opponent tumbling down the rocky slope. They reached the plateau at the top of the ridge, a relatively flat area scattered with boulders and scrub brush. Stone quickly assessed their tactical position. Defensible, but we're still exposed, he concluded. There's an old mining shaft about half a mile north. Better cover, and it might connect to other tunnels in the area. How do you know so much about these hills? Margaret asked suspiciously. Reconnaissance, Stone replied simply. I never deploy to an area without knowing all possible extraction routes. Harrison had collapsed against a boulder, his breathing labored. Margaret checked his wounds again, noting with a concern that the bleeding had worsened. He needs medical attention, she said. Soon. Stone nodded grimly. The mining shaft first, then we'll reassess. A sudden crackle from Margaret's comm interrupted them. Argret, position, mining road. Rachel's voice breaking through the jamming, but fragmented and unclear. Rachel, do you copy? What's your position? Margaret replied urgently. North of clinic. Vehicle. Pursuing. Heading toward. Hills. The transmission cut out again, but the message was clear enough. Rachel had escaped the clinic, but was being pursued and she was heading in their direction. She'll run straight into the ambush at the gap, Margaret realized. Stone was already studying the terrain with the practiced eye of a veteran's special operator. There, he pointed to a vantage point overlooking the road below. We can see the approach from there. Maybe signal her, warn her off. They helped Harrison to his feet, supporting him between them as they moved to the overlook Stone had identified. From this position, they could see a mile or more of the winding mining road, including the ambush point they had just escaped. In the distance, a plume of dust marked a vehicle approaching at high speed. "That's got to be her," Margaret said, raising her rifle scope to get a better view. Through the magnified optics, she could make out a dirt bike racing up the road, a single rider leaning low over the handlebars. Rachel. Behind her, at least a quarter-mile back, two SUVs pursued, gaining slowly but steadily on the less powerful motorcycle. "She'll never make it through the gap," Stone observed. "They've reinforced the ambush position." Margaret could see he was right. Additional men had taken up positions on both sides of the narrow passage, creating an even more effective kill zone than the one they had barely escaped. "We need to warn her," Margaret said, reaching for her comm again. Stone shook his head. "Jamming's still active. She won't hear you." "Then we signal her." Margaret unscrewed the rifle scope from her weapon. "Sunlight on the lens. Old school." Stone nodded approvingly. "Might work if she's looking up." Margaret positioned the scope to catch the sun, flashing it in a deliberate pattern: 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. SOS. The universal distress signal that any operator would recognize. Through Harrison's binoculars, she watched Rachel racing toward the ambush point, seemingly unaware of the danger ahead. The motorcycle ate up the distance with alarming speed. "Come on, Rachel," Margaret muttered. "Look up. See the signal." As if hearing her plea, Rachel's head tilted slightly upward. The motorcycle suddenly swerved, leaving the road entirely and cutting across the open terrain to the west. "She saw it," Margaret confirmed, relief evident in her voice. Rachel's off-road detour had caught her pursuers by surprise. The SUV slowed, unable to follow directly across the rough terrain. This gave Rachel precious seconds to increase her lead, navigating through the scrubland with remarkable skill. "She's heading for that arroyo," Stone observed, pointing to a dry stream bed that cut across the landscape. "Smart. It'll provide cover and let her around the ambush." Margaret watched as Rachel disappeared into the arroyo, temporarily hidden from both her pursuers and the ambushers at the gap. The SUVs had split up, one continuing on the road while the other attempted to parallel Rachel's route across the open ground. "We need to move," Stone urged. "The mining shaft is our best option for defensible position." Margaret nodded reluctantly. They couldn't help Rachel from here, and Harrison's condition was deteriorating. Their priority had to be securing the flash drive and keeping Harrison alive. They made their way north along the ridge, moving as quickly as Harrison's injuries would allow. The old mining shaft appeared as Stone had described, a dark opening in the hillside, partially concealed by scrub brush and fallen rocks. It looked like it hadn't been used in decades. "How stable is it?" Margaret asked skeptically. "Solid enough," Stone replied. "These old silver mines were well constructed. This one's been abandoned since the 50s, but the main supports should still be intact." They helped Harrison inside, finding the temperature noticeably cooler in the darkness of the shaft. Stone produced a small tactical flashlight, revealing a tunnel that extended deep into the hillside, its timber supports darkened with age, but still apparently functional. "We can defend this position," Stone said, indicating the narrow entrance. "One person could hold off a dozen attackers." Margaret nodded agreement. The tactical situation was straightforward. The shaft provided excellent cover with only one approach to defend, but their strategic position remained precarious. They were isolated with an injured man, limited ammunition, and no clear extraction plan. "What about Rachel?" Harrison asked weakly as Margaret tended to his wounds using the limited medical supplies from her tactical kit. "She knows the fallback positions," Margaret replied. "If anyone can make it through, it's her." Stone had taken up position near the entrance, keeping watch on the approach. "I count 4 tangos moving up the slope," he reported, taking their time, being cautious. Margaret finished bandaging Harrison's leg and moved to join Stone at the entrance. "Options? Limited," he admitted. "We could try to hold this position until dark, then attempt to slip past them. But with Harrison's injuries, he won't make it," Margaret concluded grimly, "and we're low on ammunition." Stone studied her face in the dim light filtering through the cave entrance. "There's something else you should know about the drive." Margaret tensed. "What about it?" "It doesn't just contain evidence about our operation in Vegas. It has information about your husband's death. Detailed information." Margaret's breath caught. "You said you didn't know." "I didn't order it. Stone interrupted. But after it happened, I investigated. Robert Wilson was a good cop. Too good. He started noticing patterns in prescription rates across county lines, connecting dots that nobody else had seen. He got close enough that someone panicked. Vegas, Stone nodded. One of his early infiltrators in my organization. A man named Diaz. He ordered the hit without my authorization using Luis Martinez as the trigger man. And you did nothing. Margaret's voice was dangerously quiet. By the time I discovered what had happened, Diaz had already been eliminated by Vega's people tying up loose ends. Martinez disappeared, presumed dead. Stone's expression was grim. I kept records, though. Names, dates, the complete chain of events. It's all on that drive. Margaret absorbed this information, emotions warring within her grief rage, the hunger for justice long denied. Why tell me this now? Because you deserve to know, and because if neither of us makes it out of here, I wanted someone to know the truth. Stone's eyes met hers directly. I've done many things I'm not proud of, Reynolds, but I never targeted innocent law enforcement officers. And I never would have authorized a hit if I'd known it would leave one of my former comrades a widow. Before Margaret could respond, gunfire erupted outside the cave. But the shots weren't directed at them. They seemed to be firing at another target. Rachel, Margaret realized, moving to get a better view from the cave entrance. Through the limited opening, she could see Vega's men scrambling for cover as accurate fire rained down on them from somewhere higher on the slope. One man fell, then another. The remaining two retreated, seeking better positions. Reynolds, Stone, Rachel's voice called from above. Status. 2+1 wounded, Margaret called back. Harrison's hit leg and arm. Hold position, reinforcements incoming. Minutes later, Rachel appeared at the cave entrance, accompanied by a welcome sight Frank Miller and two of his Vietnam veteran deputies, all armed and moving with the practiced coordination of experienced combatants. Figured you might need some backup, Frank said gruffly as they entered the cave. Good thing Steve kept that drone from his grandson. Spotted you from the air. Rachel quickly assessed the situation. Vega's forces are regrouping. We counted at least 15 operators converging on this area. We need to move before they surround us completely. Harrison can't travel far, Margaret said, indicating the wounded DEA agent. Frank nodded toward one of his deputies, Mike Reynolds, former 101st Airborne. Mike brought the first aid kit from his hunting cabin. Military-grade trauma supplies. Reynolds was already kneeling beside Harrison, administering more effective treatment than Margaret had been able to provide with her limited resources. The drive, Rachel asked. Margaret patted her vest pocket. Secure. Then our priority is extraction, Rachel said. Frank's arranged transport. There's a Forest Service fire road about 2 miles north of here. Steve's waiting with his helicopter. 2 miles through hostile territory with a wounded man, Stone observed. Not ideal. Which is why we brought this, Frank said, producing a folding tactical stretcher from the pack one of his deputies carried. Old school but effective. As Reynolds worked to stabilize Harrison for transport, Margaret pulled Rachel aside. Stone says the drive contains information about Robert's death, she said quietly. Detailed information. Rachel's expression softened with understanding. All the more reason to make sure it reaches the right hands. What about Stone himself, Margaret asked. He's implicated in all of this, even if he claims he didn't order Robert's death specifically. One problem at a time, Rachel advised. Right now, our priority is getting everyone out alive. We'll deal with Stone's legal situation once we're clear. The sound of approaching vehicles reached them from outside the cave. Vega's reinforcements had arrived. Time to move, Frank announced. There's a back passage that connects to another shaft about half a mile north. Used to use it for hunting when I was younger. They secured Harrison on the stretcher and prepared to move deeper into the mine. As they did, Stone approached Margaret. Whatever happens next, he said quietly, I want you to know I'm sorry about your husband. If I'd known sooner. Margaret studied him, trying to reconcile the man before her, who had once saved her life in Afghanistan, who now claimed ignorance of her husband's murder with the criminal mastermind who had terrorized rural communities for years. Save your apologies, she finally said. If we make it through this, you'll have plenty of time to make them to a federal judge. Stone accepted this with a slight nod, then moved to help carry Harrison's stretcher. The back passage Frank had mentioned was narrow and occasionally required them to crouch, but it was navigable. They moved as quickly as possible, where that Vega's forces might discover the connection between the two mine shafts at any moment. They emerged from the second shaft into late afternoon sunlight, finding themselves on the northern slope of the ridge, temporarily shielded from direct observation by their pursuers. Fire roads that way, Frank said, pointing north through the sparse pine forest that covered this side of the hills. About a mile and a half, mostly downhill, thankfully. They moved through the trees with as much speed as possible while carrying Harrison's stretcher. The DEA agent drifted in and out of consciousness, the blood loss taking its toll despite Reynolds' expert care. They had covered perhaps half the distance when the sound of approaching vehicles reached them again, this time from the direction of the fire road ahead. "Take cover," Frank ordered, directing them toward a dense stand of pines. From their concealed position, they watched as three black SUVs moved slowly up the fire road, stopped, and disgorged their occupants, at least a dozen heavily armed men, led by a figure Margaret recognized instantly from Harrison's description. Eduardo Vega. He was in his mid-40s, impeccably dressed despite the rough terrain, with the confident bearing of a man accustomed to command. He spoke quietly to his lieutenants, gesturing up the slope in their general direction. "They know where we're headed," Rachel whispered. "Someone must have spotted Steve's helicopter." "So much for our extraction plan," Frank muttered. Margaret assessed their situation rapidly. They were caught between Vega's forces behind them and now in front of them. The wounded Harrison couldn't move quickly or defend himself. Their ammunition was limited, and the flash drive containing evidence that could bring down both criminal networks and provide justice for Robert was in danger of falling into Vega's hands. "We need a new plan," she said quietly. Stone had been studying the terrain intently. "There's a ravine about 200 yards east, leads down to the highway. If we can reach it, we might be able to follow it out of these hills." "And then what?" Rachel asked skeptically. "We're still 30 miles from the nearest town with limited transportation options." "One problem at a time," Margaret said, echoing Rachel's earlier advice. "The ravine gives us a route away from Vega's immediate forces. We'll figure out the next step once we're clear." As they prepared to move, Frank suddenly clutched his chest, face contorting in pain as he sank to one knee. "Frank," Margaret was at his side instantly. "What is it?" "Nothing," he grimaced. "Old ticker acting up. Had 2 stents put in last year. Doctor said no stress." He attempted a wry smile. "Should have listened." This complicated their situation even further. Now they had 2 men who couldn't move under their own power. Their options were narrowing by the minute. Stone approached his expression grim but determined. "I have a suggestion. You won't like it." "Let's hear it," Margaret said. "I create a diversion. Draw them away while you get Harrison and Frank to safety." Rachel shook her head. "Suicide mission. Vega's people will cut you down before you get 50 yards. "Not if I have something they want more than you," Stone countered, looking meaningfully at Margaret's vest pocket where the flash drive was secured. "No," Margaret said firmly. "That drive is the only evidence we have." "A copy," Stone clarified. "I made a backup before we left Ridgewood. It's hidden in a place only I know. If I don't make it, I've arranged for it to be sent to the FBI automatically after 72 hours. Margaret studied him, searching for deception. "Why would you do that?" "Insurance," Stone replied simply. "Always have a fallback plan." It made a certain tactical sense, Margaret had to admit. Stone was offering himself as bait, using the flash drive to draw Vega's forces away from their position, giving them time to extract the wounded. But could she trust him after everything that had happened, everything he represented? "How do I know you won't just take the drive and disappear?" she asked. Stone's expression hardened. "Because contrary to what you might believe, I'm not the monster in this scenario. Vega is. He's the one who had your husband killed. He's the one flooding these communities with drugs that kill kids. I built a business, yes, illegal, yes, morally compromised, but I had rules, lines I wouldn't cross. Lines that got pretty blurry over time," Rachel observed coldly. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Stone shot back. "I'm offering you a tactical solution to an impossible situation. Take it or leave it, but decide quickly. Vega's men will be moving up this slope any minute." Margaret weighed the options. Stone's plan was risky and depended entirely on trusting a man who had spent years breaking the law. But their alternatives were limited and time was running out. "If you do this," she said finally, And if we all survive, I'll testify about your cooperation. Stone nodded. Fair enough. Margaret removed the flash drive from her vest pocket and handed it to Stone. Don't make me regret this. I'll lead them east, away from the ravine, Stone said, checking his weapon. Give you as much time as possible. If I make it, I'll try to circle back to the highway. Good luck, Margaret said simply. Stone offered a grim smile. Semper Fi Reynolds. He moved away from their position, working his way through the trees at an angle that would make his trail obvious to their pursuers, while drawing them away from the ravine he had identified as their escape route. You trust him, Rachel asked quietly as they watched him go. Trust is a strong word, Margaret replied. Let's say I'm making a tactical assessment. They waited until Stone had disappeared from view, then carefully began moving toward the ravine, Frank and Reynolds carrying Harrison's stretcher, while Rachel and the other deputies supported Frank, who insisted he could manage with assistance. They had just reached the edge of the ravine when gunfire erupted from the direction Stone had taken. Multiple weapons firing, then the distinctive sound of return fire, Stone engaging Vega's forces. He found them, Rachel observed, or they found him. Either way, it's working, Margaret replied. Let's move. The ravine provided good cover, its steep sides, shielding them from direct observation as they made their way down toward the highway. The going was slow, especially with 2 injured men, but they maintained steady progress. They were perhaps halfway down when a single shot rang out from above them, followed by silence. No return fire, no continued engagement. Margaret and Rachel exchanged glances, both recognizing the implication. A single shot often meant only one thing in these situations: an execution. Stone, Rachel asked quietly. Maybe, Margaret acknowledged, or maybe he got away. They continued their descent, eventually reaching the point where the ravine opened onto flatter ground near the highway. As they emerged from cover, the sound of an approaching helicopter reached them, not from the direction of the fire road where Steve had been waiting, but from the east. Get back under cover, Margaret ordered, directing the group back into the shelter of the ravine. The helicopter appeared over the ridge, not Steve's civilian Bell 206, but a larger military-style Black Hawk with no markings. It circled once, then descended toward a clear area near the highway. That's not Vega's people, Rachel said, studying the aircraft through binoculars. No cartel would fly something that conspicuous. The helicopter touched down and figures emerged, men in tactical gear, moving with military precision as they secured a perimeter around the landing zone. Federal, Harrison murmured from his stretcher, having regained consciousness. That's a DEA tactical team. How? Frank asked, bewildered. We didn't have time to call in that kind of support. Harrison managed a weak smile. Stone's backup plan, I'd wager. The one he mentioned about the drive being sent to the FBI after 72 hours bet. He had a panic button to emergency signal if things went sideways. Margaret watched as the tactical team methodically established a secure zone around the helicopter. If Harrison was right, this represented an unexpected salvation, but it also raised new questions about Stone's true intentions and connections. So what now? Rachel asked. We just walk down there and introduce ourselves. Pretty much, Harrison confirmed. Show them my credentials. They'll extract us, secure the area room. The cavalry has arrived just in the nick of time. They emerged from the ravine, approaching the helicopter with hands visible. The tactical team spotted them immediately, weapons trained in their direction, until Harrison called out an identification code that caused the team leader to signal his men to stand down. Special Agent Harrison, the team leader acknowledged as they reached the helicopter. Backup response to your emergency beacon. We have a medevac standing by for the wounded. The drive? Harrison asked. We don't have it, Margaret replied. Stone had it when he created the diversion. The team leader frowned. Stone, Michael Stone, he's here. Was, Rachel corrected. He drew Vega's forces away to give us time to escape. The team leader spoke quietly into his comm, then turned back to them. We have another team searching the area. If Stone is still alive, we'll find him. As Harrison and Frank were loaded onto the helicopter for immediate medical evacuation, Margaret found herself staring back up at the forested hillside where Stone had made his last stand. Had he sacrificed himself to give them a chance? Or had this been part of some more elaborate plan? Reynolds, Rachel said, touching her arm. We need to go. Margaret nodded, turning away from the hillside. Whatever Stone's fate, her priority now was ensuring the evidence reached the proper authorities. Evidence that would bring down Vega's cartel, dismantle Stone's network, and finally provide justice for Robert. 1 year later, the small cemetery on the outskirts of Ridgewood was peaceful in the late afternoon sun. Margaret stood before Robert's grave, now adorned with a new headstone that acknowledged his sacrifice in the line of duty. The inscription read, Robert Wilson, Deputy Sheriff, who gave his life pursuing justice. The past year had seen enormous changes both for Margaret and for Ridgewood itself. The evidence from Stone's backup drive, which had indeed been automatically delivered to the FBI, had led to the dismantling of both criminal networks with dozens of arrests across multiple states. Vega himself had been captured during the DEA raid and now faced multiple life sentences without possibility of parole. Lisa Montgomery had been found alive, held captive by Vega's organization. As Margaret had suspected, she hadn't betrayed the Sentinels voluntarily. She had been coerced through threats against her family. Now freed, she was working with the FBI's task force on cartel infiltration, her specialized knowledge proving invaluable. Stone's body had never been found despite extensive searches of the area where he had made his last stand. The official report listed him as presumed dead, though Margaret sometimes wondered. The man had built his criminal empire on careful planning and contingencies. A disappearing act wouldn't be beyond his capabilities. The clinic had been rebuilt with Dr. Preston continuing to serve as the town's primary physician. Ellen had finally retired, though she still volunteered 2 days a week. Frank had recovered from his heart episode, and following his retirement as sheriff, now taught wilderness survival skills to local teenagers. His grandson Jason had been elected the new sheriff, the youngest in Ridgewood's history. As for Margaret herself, she had made the difficult decision to remain in Ridgewood. Her cover was blown, her past exposed, but the town had embraced her anyway. These people had fought alongside her to save their community, and in doing so had become her family in a way she hadn't experienced since the Sentinels. She now worked with a special DEA task force using her medical knowledge and military experience to help rural communities combat the opioid epidemic. It wasn't the quiet life she had once sought, but it provided a purpose that honored Robert's memory while utilizing her unique skill set. Thought I might find you here, Rachel's voice came from behind her. Margaret turned to see her former teammate approaching dressed in civilian clothes, but still carrying herself with the unmistakable bearing of a special operator. Just paying my respects before I head out, Margaret explained. Rachel nodded understanding. The situation in Cedar Creek. DEA intelligence suggests they're using the same playbook Vega did here. Small town, isolated, minimal law enforcement. Perfect for establishing a new distribution hub. And they asked for you specifically. Margaret smiled slightly. The Sentinel reputation precedes me, it seems. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, both reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point. Do you ever wonder about Stone? Rachel finally asked. Whether he made it out somehow? Sometimes, Margaret admitted. There was never any blood evidence found where that final shot was heard, and his body never turned up. You think he had an exit strategy all along? Margaret shrugged. Stone always had contingency plans. It wouldn't surprise me if he's on a beach somewhere with a new identity and a portion of his ill-gotten gains. If he surfaces, we'll find him, Rachel said with certainty. Yes, Margaret agreed. We will. She placed a single white rose on Robert's grave, then turned away. The sun was setting over the Nevada hills, painting the landscape in gold and copper hues reminiscent of that morning 7 years ago when she had stood on her porch, coffee in hand, unaware that her carefully constructed peace was about to be shattered. Some battles never truly ended, Margaret reflected as they walked back to her truck. But as long as there were people willing to stand against the darkness, whether aging Vietnam veterans, small-town doctors and nurses, or former special operators seeking redemption, there was hope. The nurse had been knocked to the ground. The Sentinel had risen up, and Margaret Wilson had finally found her peace somewhere in between.